Okay, we are live. Welcome to Rick, Rabbi, and Rashi for the Parsha of Shmini. It's a really interesting Parsha, a lot going on in it. And we'll jump right to Rick. You read the Parsha. Which topics piqued your interest?
So Rabbi, obviously this is the most meaty Parsha we've seen in the last 3 weeks. There was a lot to unpack here. We could probably stay on this call for 2 days, but I have 3 things that are sort of concerned to me as I read through it, and I'd like you to sort of tease out some of the ideas. Now, first thing is, I'm very interested in numbers. I keep asking them about the number of 7. I'm beginning to get an answer that the number of 7 is sort of about the natural order of things. I'm beginning to understand that. But then all of a sudden, God sort of throws a curveball at us, right? Now he adds in the 8th day, right? It's like for 7 days, Moses builds the tabernacle, takes it apart, builds it, takes it apart, blah, blah, blah. And on the 8th day, even he who finishes building it, it still takes the divine intervention of God to finish it, because Aaron comes in where Moses is not allowed to come in. And so it's the 8th day. So I have questions about sort of like the 8th day, right? So as I was thinking about it, I was thinking about the Nes Gadol, the big miracle that happened during Hanukkah, and that the idea is that the Chanukiah is eight branches, right? So you got the 7 natural branches, and then the 8th is where the Shekhinah comes to us. It's it sort of puts the whole miracle together in one place. So I have a question about that. And then obviously there are some other questions about the number 8, but let's see if we can talk about the miracle of Hanukkah first, which we realize is a very minor holiday. It's nothing significant in terms of Jewish.
So you picked up on a big theme that's going to be in a lot of Judaism: 7 and 8, 7 days of the week, 7 days of the days of creation in the Torah, all representing the natural order. A cycle, a week is a natural order cycle. 8 is the number of infinity, right? 8, and it's also, in this context, it's one beyond. It's just beyond the natural order, just beyond, and that's in our context here. Just it's interesting how last week's Torah portion, Tzav, describes the 7 days of prep, of inauguration. Moshe, just inaugurating the temple, but not yet seeing the divine presence rest. And we, for some reason, split this. Really, it could be one story. 7, they work 7 days, and 8, God rests. But actually, it splits into 2 weeks, which is very interesting about the relationship of the 7 and the 8. That I think there's a bit of a split. We have to realize that not only is 8 beyond, but 7 is not like, if we do the business plan of the 7 days of inauguration, then it will lead to the 8th, to that supernatural miracle. Like in the movies, when they crack the code and the magic pours out of the dungeon or whatever, it's not like you can crack some code or do the work, and it's a different level. It's miraculous. However, there is a relationship that you do the 7 days of the week, you do the 7 days of the cycle of 7, you work within nature, and then God chooses to reward your work with a miracle. But it's almost like, remember, the result, that the in this case, the divine presence, or even in our life today, the result of having a successful outcome, God always reserves a little bit of, hey, this is a little bit of a minor miracle. So we do our work, we work within nature, not because we believe that nature is in of itself powerful, but because God wants us to work within nature and make a natural vessel. So we do so. Once we do that, we sit back and we wait for God we did the natural partnership, and we sit back and wait for God to literally put it all into play. So that's obvious in the biggest way by the temple, because you need the Shekhinah. Like you could have all the nice rites in the world, there's no divine presence. It's what type of temple is this? So, that's why Shmini is its own parsha. God on the 8th day, God appeared. And back to Hanukkah.
Right. Yeah.
I want to say this is a biblical narrative. Hanukkah is a post-biblical story. However, it is actually it's a very, in a way, it takes this lesson of that they worked 7 days in the temple, and the eighth day God did a miracle and rested in the temple. This shows us that even post-biblical times, in a time of galut, of diaspora, it wasn't diaspora, but it was a time of
exile.
Well, it wasn't exile. They were still in Israel, but it was a time of spiritual darkening, like that. They were occupied by outside empires and so on. It was the beginning of the end, as they said. So you might say that, well, there's no miracles, so this is nice and dandy, but in the biblical time, we can appreciate the number 8, miracles. But after the temple's destroyed, there's no 8, there's no miracles. Comes the time of Hanukkah, which was a time of darkness, of this occupation of Syrian Greek army. And the Jews themselves, by the way, were very, very assimilated. They were very pagan, the Jews. Most of the Jews were pagan in the Hanukkah story. People don't realize that. So it was a very dark time. Yet, a small group of Jews, the Maccabees and their followers, they believed that God is still accessible, and therefore they have to have self-sacrifice to do the mitzvahs, even in the face of a suicide mission, because they are no real match for the Greek army. But because they realize that this is so important, that they're willing to actually give their lives for it, what that did in effect was it caused a revelation of that supernatural part of the soul. It's not even, it's not tainted by our day-to-day lives. It's always like a little vessel of oil. They activated it and it caused the miracle. And then the miracle was even further verified when they lit the menorah for 1 day and it lasted 8 days. I mean, God's saying, even in a time of darkness, you can experience miracles, but it's going to take the first step, but a step will be, you're going to have to break your own nature. So if you want God in this time of diaspora, of exile, of spiritual darkness, you want to see a divine presence, the Hanukkah story gives us that the clue. You got to go out of your own nature, go beyond, your pragmatic self, and go beyond that, and that elicits a reciprocal response of God making a miracle of the 8 days. So I think, in very short, the Hanukkah story is the lesson of this parsha, but more applicable to us in a time of diaspora.
So let me take that number 8 one more step further, because if we think of the number 8 as sort of the revelation of God in some divine way to us, the Shekhinah, right?
And very simple. 8 is infinity.
Yeah. No, I'm totally on board with everything you've just said. So if I follow this logically to its conclusion, if Shiva is in the natural world, why isn't Shiva 8 days so that the divine intervention takes place at death?
Just for those that don't know, Shiva, and Rick is saying it was such a natural Israeli pronunciation. Shiva, in us American Jews, Shiva, Shiva, sitting the mourning rites, the 7-day mourning rites for a deceased. So you're saying that if we're trying to really recover from death, which is maybe going to take a little bit of a mini miracle, wouldn't 8 days of mourning be better than 7, which is natural? And it's a good point. Although you could say that what we do is always going to be characterized by 7. I know we spoke earlier, but I had another thought. Our efforts has to begin, be really good, but then end at a certain point. That's our efforts, what we do. Shiva 7 is that we work really hard, but it ends. We don't. I know all the movies and all the productivity culture is, if you just stay work 150 hours and you'll get that big break. Judaism knows you have to work in nature, and don't make your efforts. Don't start playing God that your uber efforts are going to now be like make it happen. You have to stop at after the cycle of nature, whatever that is in the situation, and wait almost. Don't just don't just don't do has this don't just sit there, do nothing. It's just like wait and let God finish it. So for consolation, which only God can do to a person, I think we would make sense. We only do 7. We don't want to do more. And on the contrary, we only the last day of the morning of the Shiva, we actually don't even do a full day. We only do a couple hours. So we try to like expedite it to finish quickly. And I think once we do just enough what we need to do, we say, okay, God, now you console us.
And I think in our earlier discussion before we got on the podcast, you talked more about, we want to reduce the amount of suffering, to stretch it out. It's not what we are. And that to prolong the idea of death in the morning. And I think you and I had a bit of a sidebar when we talked about it, but I saw Judaism as sort of a life-affirming religion where we talk about things like l'chaim, right? That we want to focus on life and not on death, even though we still need to be respectful.
And some people, right? And some people, 7 days might not feel like enough to mourn, rightfully so. Yet the Judaism, by giving this prescription, is saying it's going to help us be able to affirm and move on quicker than later, as well as there is mystical ideas that the soul of the deceased is tethered to the home where the Shiva happens to some degree, and we want to release it. We want to let it go. We want to let it, go on its aliyah, its elevation. So, yeah, both for the living and for the deceased, we want to reduce the grief.
I'm sure this won't be the last time we discuss numbers. I'm fascinated by them. Maybe it's because I just work with numbers all the time. So let's go to something else, and that is there's a large discussion about kashrut here. I learned something this week that I didn't know, and that was that animals that are not kosher are not considered bad. What it really is it's really about our ability to maintain self-control over ourselves, which is a theme that we have quite a bit within the religion. I mean, we fast during Yom Kippur, for example, to exercise the fact that we have control of our lives. So I think it's very interesting, but it raises the question within the parsha based on it's about divine consciousness. And I'm struggling with what a good definition of that is. I mean, they had something in the commentaries which sort of dealt with something about the purpose of creation is the supernatural divine consciousness within the physical world. But to me, that wasn't satisfying. So I'm turning.
You saw this in reference to kosher somewhere, that this will help us have divine consciousness.
Yes, I think so. I didn't keep that in my so much. I didn't mark it, but
trying to see where. No, here.
Maybe it's in the commentary that I actually read it, Rabbi.
Okay, so I think I want to just touch upon what you said before.
Okay.
There's a like a lot of things, because Judaism wasn't really properly conveyed in the earlier part of the 20th century to the youth of those days. People had a lot of ideas. They had religious parents, but they didn't really. It was much more behavioral, cultural, but the deep ideas weren't accessible to be conveyed from the immigrants or the greeners to the American youth, and therefore people have a lot of. They were very educated in American, education. In Judaism, they look at Judaism, which was never really explained to them. It was kind of, they made some assumptions that weren't always true, but it wasn't their fault. They weren't explained to them. So, one of the ideas of kosher is that it's about hygiene, which the Rambam brings that down as a sidebar. But that's not the main. Kosher in general is a spiritual thing. It is particularly a spiritual mitzvah. There are mitzvahs that are, I say many mitzvahs are rational, law and order and, kindness. To not eat this animal and to yes eat that animal is not a rational mitzvah. This is a spiritual mitzvah. Meaning, What is my spiritual mitzvah? Everything's a spiritual mitzvah. When you give charity, it's not a spiritual mitzvah. Yeah, but it's enclosed in a very rational, palpable cloak. You don't have to you don't have to be a believer to see how charity is a good thing, right?
Right.
But kosher, you don't have that. You can make some ideas, and even Rambam talked there, but you really get down to it, is someone who abstains, eats a kosher diet, going to be healthier than someone who doesn't, who eats healthy but not kosher food? You can have unhealthy kosher and healthy unkosher. So you're forced to say this is really something where the rational cloak is not there, and therefore it's in its pristine spiritual meaning, because there is no other meaning. And this is what we call a chayk. There's three categories of mitzvah. The mishpatim are the rational, the edus are the commemorative, the memorial ones, the holidays. And then you have the chukim. The chukim are the decrees. They are spiritually pristine mitzvahs. They don't have a rational reason. Now, you might then, even with that type of humility approaching the mitzvah of kosher, you might say, well, if it's saying pigs are not good and cows are good, Judaism must really think pigs are bad and cows are better. And you mentioned, I think it's important to unpack this, is that that's not the case,
Right.
Because everything we believe comes from God. The question is what's God's manual of how to interact with this thing in order to utilize it to reconnect its independent physical self to oneness? What's the procedures to reconnect? Again, everything in this world is about reconnecting. There's the physical, it seems detached. We got to reconnect it, utilize it, sublimate it for the spiritual. So how do you sublimate a cow? So the Torah tells you can eat it. It's one of the things you don't have to. You can also use it as for the leather for other things. But one way that is acceptable is you can eat this food. And of course, as you mentioned, it has to be done. You can eat it, kosher food, and be a glutton. And then while it's kosher, it's temporarily not being sublimated because the energy is being self-directed. So it could be you could do teshuvah and realign it, but that's the goal, is to take a cow. As I told you, did I tell you the story? The guy who they had a Farbrengen in Russia, and Farbrengen, is when the Hasidim get together and they say a little l'chaim, have some food, and then the elders, the teachers will share some ideas, and people will share what they're struggling with. It's kind of like a group therapy, but you need food. You need food to make it go. And this guy, they ran out of food. So the host was the teacher, and they had a small business. And his wife, they had a sheep that they gave the wool. They made money off the wool. It was a side gig. And they said, okay, go slaughter the sheep, and we're going to eat it. Then we're going to continue the Farbrengen, because a lot of spiritual. It was really good. It was a very big experience. They slaughter it. There's a sheikhet. They do it. They eat it. Good. The next day, the wife says, husband, where's the sheep? It's missing. So he said, it's not missing. Yesterday it said ba, and now it's saying Shema Yisrael Shem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. It's yesterday ba, and now it said Echad, because it was utilized for them to do their service and get more closer to God. So that's what kosher is about. A pig, God says, it's not for us to do it that way. The energy, because the whole thing is spiritual. Like the whole thing is the spiritual classification. A pig's spirituality is not able to be sublimated through ingesting it. It has to be done in other ways. It could be to use it for other stuff. It could be used to even get food to not. But for a Jewish person to have this sort of direct way, it's not going to do that. So pig isn't bad. As a matter of fact, it says in the bottom, the pig, it's actually from a loftier source, that it cannot come in this world in a packaging we can deal with, because it's too holy. Therefore, that which is highest falls farther. So just to sum up, you were mentioning I know I got long-winded. What was the question again?
We were talking about the divine consciousness. And we were
Divine
just
consciousness. So then I addressed it. The goal is to take ba and to make it into a chad. So divine consciousness, that you utilize things for God's will. And by the way, we didn't talk about this before, but this is very important. I want to tell you something fascinating. The Rebbe typically didn't play mystic. I'm reading, there's a program now to read his letters. It's the Rebbe's birthday in like 20 days from now. So they're doing 30 letters for 30 days. If you go to 30lettersand30days.com, you'll see, and they're doing a sampling of the Rebbe's tens of thousands of letters. Just interesting the way the man wrote letters. It took all the wisdom and counseled people with the wisdom. He said an interesting idea. This is in a letter, or actually it was in a talk. He says, I was wondering, so in spite of that the Rebbe typically didn't play the mystic, occasionally he did, or gave a theory. So I'm wondering why in a span of 150 years, 100 years, this is 1960s, had this 1970, in a span of 100 years, right? 1870, the Enlightenment, till then, most Jews started out 90% were religious, right? Maybe 10% weren't, or whatever it was. And then in 100 years, the opposite. Most are not religious, are not Torah observant, not even knowledge, don't have access to it. How do we go from like, that's a pretty rapid, pace. And he says, you can't just say it's because of emancipation and enlightenment. There has to be a spiritual reason as well, which is interesting that he mentioned, a little bit playing the mystic. And he says, I'd have to say the way it could happen so quick from the beginning of the 20th century till now, that you go from, people came from kosher homes, even in America, and, till the point of like people, many homes that they didn't even heard, the great grandkids wouldn't even know what kosher is to even like know anything different. How did we get there? He said, certain mitzvahs are very key, and they're so key that for some, they are spiritual armor. And these mitzvahs, when they were, I guess, stopped being done, it opened up a certain quick assimilation. And what were the mitzvahs? One was kosher. He said kosher is a certain spiritual, but divine consciousness. Kosher food, according to the way the commentaries say, it refines the mind to appreciate divinity more. That's it. That's the basic idea. So when you take that away, it's not a physical thing. It's a spiritual sensitivity. In Yiddish, an Edelkeit. So I think in regards to the divine consciousness, kosher helps our physical body and brain be a little more refined to imbibe some of this divine truths, which we can learn and we can appreciate. But you want to get even more, the kosher helps.
Okay, so I'm going to have to ask you the Hillel question because you got to stand on one foot. We have very little time to talk.
But 1 minute left. Yeah, I got to run.
One more pressing question, and that is, what is the significance of Avihu and Nadav's death? The idea that they breathe in the Shekhinah when they're holding the fire pan. What is the significance of that?
So very, very short.
And they received the divine
kiss. The story was the opening day of the temple. The two sons of Aaron, they came in without permission. They brought a certain incense offering into the Holy of Holies. And it says the divine, their souls left their bodies. So they sinned apparently, right? They came in unauthorized. There's different opinions. Some say that they didn't want to get married. They wanted to be this otherworldliness, spiritual seekers. Another one says they drank wine. And what's funny is all these things have a common denominator. They're all like out of body experience, very seekerness, like drinking or not getting married because they want to be like almost celibate spiritual seekers, or coming unauthorized to the Holy of Holies. There's like this intense longing that's not being restrained. And as a matter of fact, that shows that they were such spiritual people that it wasn't in the sense of a punishment. It was almost like more like a natural result. They're so spiritual, their body and they kept going further and further, the bodies left their soul. So that's the short story of Nadav and Avihu, a tragic story, but there is a lesson for us, is that we have to mirror them to be seekerness, but we also have to remember there has to be always a pullback into how can this be about life and not about escaping life.
Thank you, Rabbi. It was a nice
A wonderful
conversation.
Shabbos, and
Thank you. Shabbat
best.
shalom to